everyone. Welcome back to Frankly Speaking. I'm your host, Frank. Let's call this part 8 of Mussolini, an Italian-American perspective. Tonight, I'm going to try and get into some economic philosophy, okay? I'm going to give it a shot, guys. I'm not very good at this kind of stuff, but I think it's important in sort of as we examine fascism and compare it to the other two major economic strands of philosophy of the 20th century with capitalism and Marxism. And I'll do my best. Listen, there's going to be people that are going to be able to speak better to this than I can. And I may get a few things wrong here, but I'll take a crack at it, what I see and how I see it from my perspective. So I was cruising around YouTube the other day, and I came across a video that tried to explain what fascism was. I'll put the link of the video in the description here, and you guys can see it for yourself. And it's kind of a reference point for this video. So it's kind of a response video in the way that I'm doing. And, you know, it comes down to the basic notion of what is fascism, where does it fall on the pendulum between capitalism and Marxism? And based upon this video, judging who Mussolini was, his life experience, where he came from, having a Marxist background, starting with his father, and then evolving into what we call fascism, the conclusion of the video was that fascism at the end of the day is really nothing more than Marxism without the international part, right? Which in some ways on the surface kind of makes sense, where Mussolini gets back from World War I, along with all the other veterans, the opposition to World War I, the socialists, the communists that have infiltrated into Italy, a lot of them from the Soviet Union, are disrespecting the soldiers coming back. Hence, lots of anti-red, anti-internationalist sentimentalities begin to sweep Italy. Mussolini, being one of the soldiers that got back, becomes disenchanted with international Marxism. Hence, he creates his own form of Marxism without the international element into it, which is called fascism. And that, in a nutshell, was the thesis of this documentary that I was watching. Now, you know, with me, guys, I get down to the most basic elements of everything. And I was thinking about this for a few days, and it quite didn't sit right with me because, listen, I want to be honest about this and do the best analysis that I can, understanding this and being fair in the light of history and philosophy and trying to get to the truth of the matter. But this thing didn't sit well with me. First of all, for practical reasons, fascism believed in markets. They believed in well-ordered markets. Granted, they did not believe in free markets, right? Because they were nationalists. They wouldn't accept something like on Amazon or Google or wherever it is going overseas to use slave labor. They believe that Italian companies should work in Italy or should work for Italy primarily because we have sort of a national brotherhood of sorts. That's what fascists believe. I'm trying to find the proper words here, to where we're fellow countrymen. We're in this thing together to a certain degree. And we have to work with each other and not go overseas and use slave labor from other nations and undercut and circumvent the nation of your origins. But they did believe in markets. Mussolini specifically believed in private property rights. Mussolini was against the death tax, understood the nature and the importance of money. If you know Mussolini, he hated money because it caused all kinds of problems. Especially in this battle between labor and capital, it's an argument always about money. And this is why with fascism, it tries to create a movement that's simply bigger than this material dialectic, right? And this is where the communists and the capitalists always go to war with each other, because it's always about the material dialectic, right? It's about capital, it's about money, it's about the means of production, and who's going to get more, who's going to win this battle. where Mussolini comes around and says, wait a minute, there's more to life, there's more to our human nature than simply always worrying about making the money, the money, the money, right? Kind of a thing. There's honor, there's duty, there's country, there's tradition, there's history, and there's faith, right? To reduce everything down to simple material value, he thought was one of the great crimes of modern civilization. And fascism originally, while it's a secular ideology, it tries to bring in other elements of a greater common good, right? That's why they focus on things like sports and history and tradition, and focused on something more than just this fight between labor and capital. They try to create a greater community while working within the confines of this fallen world when in regards to labor and capital, and trying to bridge that gap. And part of bridging that gap, their idea was to go back to the old medieval guild system, or something akin to the old medieval guild system that they called syndicalism, right? Now, what is syndicalism? Syndicalism, I guess, in a way, is a form of unionization, but it's a form of unionization that involves a political wing, a political apparatus, right? Where if you would look at, let's say, a union in America in a capitalist sense, you have a situation where there is no mediator between the union and capital, where they would kind of go at it and fight it out and try and cut the best deal that they can without government intervention. The medieval guild system and something akin to that the fascists were trying to find or accomplish would involve the corporation, right? The corporation being an extension of the government wing or the government arm. And so that government wing, that corporation, will be a broker between capital and labor, bring them together to find common cause. And so we wouldn't have a disruption of the economy. Let's remember, Marxists were running all over Europe at the time. They were disrupting the economic cycle by constantly striking, shutting down production, hurting economies, hurting workers, hurting governments. And the fascists said, we can't live this way, specifically in Italy. As the red wave came in from the Soviet Union that had actually taken over towns and individual markets, because Italy was a weak constitutional monarchy. And again, the king being in a quandary, right? Knowing what happened to the Tsar in Russia in 1917, the Kaiser falls in 1918, 1990, Mussolini declares there's a Russian army camped out in Italy. The king of Italy doesn't want another revolution being launched in Italy at that time. And this is how fascism arises. And how does fascism arise? It arises because it goes to the countrysides, to where the Marxists had taken over land, property, they destroyed businesses, they burned down farms, they take over markets, they shut down factories, and the fascists start fighting back in the countrysides. And the deal that the fascists actually cut with the landowners, the shopkeeper, the factories is, listen, this is what we're going to do. If you are willing to rent or lease or sell plots of land to people who want to work the land, we will protect you. Because the end goal of the fascists was to get people back on the land, because that's where they saw an inherent value. They didn't see it in terms of just money and production. They wanted to give real meaning to people, real purpose to people, and working the land was part of that. Because once you're on your land, you actually have true autonomy, right? It's like in America, we've all, talked about the economic engine of prosperity. You got to go to college. You got to work up the, corporate ladder to make the money and achieve success and financial prosperity. And yet we do that. And then the government or other entities like the Federal Reserve come around and they manipulate the money and they lower our status. And we have no control over that. But when you're on the land, you have control of it. It's your land for that matter. And this is what the fascists were striving for, is to get people back on land, which goes back to the idea of collectivization. Is fascism Marxism without internationalism? Well, the Marxists in the Soviet Union were collectivizing everything. They were taking land away from the people, land away from the farmers. Fascists early on in the Mussolini regime were putting people back on the land, which already, in my opinion, it's a kill shot in the argument that fascism was Marxism without internationalism. But I digress. And so this was the idea. Now, the question, of course, is when it comes to labor jobs, factory jobs, things of that nature, this battle between capital and labor, and how do they negotiate? Fascists believe that there should have been a corporate body, a third party in between the two to bring them together, set up courts, set up tribunals, and ultimately a bargaining method so labor and capital were always not constantly at each other's throats, striking and disrupting commerce. That was the idea. This is what they were doing in the old world, and it worked very well. Now, the question, of course, is, and this is where the Marxism charge comes in, is that, well, you know, in a free society, right, unions and capital come together, and there's nobody else in here. Government doesn't step in. Let them have it. That's a free society, right? So the fact that we have a corporate body interjecting as a third party, as a negotiating broker source, that's seen as big government, right? That's seen as government intervention into the marketplace. And in some respects, I could see that. But again, fascism and corporatism, which is the economic system of fascism, is much more complex than that. It was not collectivizing. It was putting people back on the land. It didn't believe in these massive tax rates, especially with the poor. And then most of all, and even more importantly of all, it brought the church in to create a greater social order, which, for Mussolini's part, when he brings the church in 1929, he breaks away from the fascists to a certain degree, right? Because fascism is found as a secular ideology. It doesn't want the church in the role of how Mussolini brought it in to be sort of that integralist faith of the nation. But again, with fascism, especially when you look at the circumstances on the ground, you look at Italy was probably 95 to 98% Catholic at the time. In many ways, fascism needed Catholicism. And Mussolini brings the church in and really hands it over real power over the culture. Marriage, it bans contraception, it bans divorce, it gives the schools over to the church, it gives the orphanages to the church, it gives a real substance power to create a greater, broader social structure and moral order that would play into, again, the entire brokerage process between capital and labor. And this is big. This is big. And the reason why it's big is because we've seen what's happened in nations that don't have the church in place, or even natural law for that matter. What has happened in the West in regards to this battle between capital and labor? Well, labor has been wiped out. Unions have been wiped out in America, effectively speaking, right? Our friends of the political right claim that fascism has risen in America because we've had the corporations, commercial corporations, collude with government. Hence, what have we seen? Really, the diminishment of private unions. Now, which is interesting, right? Because public sector unions have risen in America. Private unions have diminished. Why have public sector unions have risen? Because there's nobody there to negotiate on behalf of the taxpayer. It's a government job. But here we are in the supposed free market system where unions and labor are supposed to hammer it out. And what have we seen? We've actually seen the collusion between government and big business, commercial corporations, which is actually oligarchical rule. So what have you effectively done? You've actually created another system with even bigger governments attached to it than what at least the fascists were trying to do through the corporatist system, through the guild system. Because at least with the fascist system, the government comes in as an honest broker, or at least it tries to, right? Following human nature, governments can always get bought out, right? I understand that. I'm not a fool. But here in the West, we pretended like this buyout has never happened when it's happened right before our very eyes. And we've now seen this collusion. So what is the point of having a free system when governments and big business collude, right? And this is a basic argument that you see within libertarian movements. Even people like at the von Mises have always admitted that at some point, somebody's going to win at the end of the day, whether it's government or whether it's big business, somebody will buy out the other, and the other party will be screwed. In essence, your free market evaporates when this corruption happens in the marketplace. And then who is the moral arbiter of truth? Who is that broker that resets this corruption within sort of the free market system? Nobody. That's why in America we can't fix any of these problems. That's why the unions have been wiped out. That's why wages have been dropping for 40, 50, 60 years, and everything has gravitated toward this government commercial corporation alliance. And workers have fallen far behind. So tell me how that's any better than what the fascists propose. At least the fascists propose that there will be a political wing, a broker that presents itself to both sides. There's no secret deals here behind the scenes, like in a big bureaucratic capital like Washington, D.C. The political wing, the corporation presents itself as that body to speak for both. At least that's the attempt. But I think it goes even further and deeper than that, because in a liberal society like America, where we rejected natural law, but even more so, we rejected the church, where is the moral underpinnings to correct a lot of the problems that we see in the West, particularly with the corruption between labor and capital in America, and then when you get the government involved? Where are the moral underpinnings? How do we fix these problems? Who determines right and wrong, fair and foul? Nobody. We say the capitalist system, survival of the fittest, the strong shall survive, the weak shall perish. And this is what we've seen. The corporations have risen and labor has been crushed in America. That's why wages have dropped, standards of living have dropped, and there's all kinds of corruption at that level. But in Italy, especially after Mussolini brings the church in, there is a moral arbiter of truth. And because Italians are nationalistic, there's also a sense of camaraderie, right? Is that how you say it? There's also a sense of community. And not only are they all Italians, they're all Catholics on top of it all when they're going to the bargaining table. And this is very critical. Let's go back for a second to the medieval guild system, which is what the fascists were trying to mimic. At least that's what they told us. If there was some other motivation behind the scenes, I don't know. But I'm giving you the philosophical foundations of what they were thinking at the time. When we went back to the medieval guild system, right, the guild system brought labor and capital together with a broker in the middle between the two. They negotiated the best terms and conditions for the particular industry that they were representing. They did not view labor and capital as enemies, but working together, the best of the industry, trying to get the best wages for the workers, obviously, but also considering that profit is important for business and the risk that capital took. They gave insurance policies to sick workers, to widows. There's all kinds of functions and benefits that the guilds negotiated. But there's one other critical faction, and I'll quote here historian Charles Coulomb, that the guilds presented, and that is for every guild there was a patron saint. A patron saint. Now this is critical, because this brings in a moral component to the negotiating table, not to mention the greater society as a whole. So when you sit across the table when labor and capital sit across the table from each other, you're not just labor and capital. These are really communist terms is what they are, right? Trying to create this sort of division between the two, trying to distinguish the two. But you're also Catholics sitting out there. You're Italians and you're Catholics. And you got a patron saint looking down upon you, which reflects the greater morality of the church and the culture. Let's remember, these were homogenous cultures. There's a symbiotic relation between the government and the church, and there's a symbiotic relation between labor and capital with, again, a certain moral and social order looking down upon how these two forces are going to come together to negotiate these ideas. Was it a perfect system? No, because we have a fallen human nature, but they tried to create a scenario where we would look at each other as human beings with compassion and empathy and understanding and fairness and honesty. What happens in the capitalist system? Quite simple, survival of the fittest. We've always been taught you crush your enemy. If you can take more or the art of the deal, right? Negotiate a better deal. You're the winner. That's what you're supposed to do. Because competition is what drives a strong economy. But it also crushes people. And this is what we've seen within the battle of capital and labor in the West. As labor has fallen further and further and further behind. And guess what? Capital won. They won that battle of survival of the fittest. So how do we fix this? There's no church in place. There's no social structure in place. Everybody's an extreme individual. How do you fix this problem? You can't. And that's why we have political systems in the West that are spiraling out of control. Now, I'm not suggesting the fascist system would have been perfect. We don't know what would have happened. They were never given a chance. And I would argue they weren't given a chance because they were seen as a threat from both the capitalists and the Marxists who didn't want the system to come down. Because the bottom line, the one thing that the capitalist system and the communist system have in common is there's clear winners and losers, right? In the capitalist system, it's those that have ambition, know how to work the backdoor deals, generally those with the highest IQ. Oftentimes, morality is skewed because, again, there's no greater social order, there's no church in place. Those that are that have less moral scruples, you do very well in the capitalist system. In the communist system, which is a collectivist system, it's basically a fight to the top. It's a fight to power. And those that get to the top live well, and everybody at the bottom gets screwed. But the fascist system tried to, again, bridge this gap. It tried. That was the idea, at least. Again, I don't know if it would have worked, but it deserves a respect because there's a great disrespect on both the other sides that take extreme measures. One is all about individual rights that leads to the corruption of culture, and the other side is all about collectivization, which crushes individual rights in totality, right? What was the big concern of Giovanni Gentile? When he looked at the West, when he looked at the Anglo-liberal world, he thought that too much power was given to the individual. This led to a certain element of corruption. And we've seen that now. He looked at the East and said, wait a minute, this collectivization isn't good because you're totally crushing individual incentive for people to work. But there's got to be a balance in between the two. And that's why fascism was called the third way. Now, let me get back to the issue. Was fascism Marxism without collectivization? I think you could argue that introducing a third-party broker, a government extension, into be a broker between capital and labor, I think you could interpret it that way. But I still don't see an effective difference what we have in the capitalist nations, where government always becomes the powerhouse and the broker. And we see governments get involved in the affairs of business. Only they've done it more underhandedly behind the scenes. At least in a fascist system, it appears to me at least, right, that they're trying to be upfront with it. And I think that matters at the end of the day. So that was the attempt. Is fascism Marxism without internationalism? I don't see it. I don't see it. They believe in private property. They don't believe in inheritance tax. They believe in well-ordered markets. They didn't print money through central banks like we've done in America and in the East, right? Where they just print money, fiat money. They actually used real money. They had a very moderate tax system. They brought the church in. And while in the East, they absolutely crushed faith and religion in the Soviet Union, in the West, in the liberal Protestant nations, Anglo nations, they used indifferentism to destroy the faith. This is why we've gone through this great apostasy under the dictates of liberalism at the end of the day, right? So these are all things to consider. Marxism, fascism, listen, I think you see a true transformation of what Mussolini became. And even more so, Mussolini transformed from fascism and the fascist philosophers, if we're being honest. There is a quote in the Nicholas Ferro book where basically Mussolini says, and I'm paraphrasing here, listen, I don't follow fascism, fascism follows me. Mussolini continued to evolve in his thinking, trying to again, honor the dictates of what fascism was originally, but also being very practical. The moment he brings the church in, he's breaking from the fascist philosophers big time then. And so there's a Mussolini that continues to look at things, adjust, adapt. I'm not sure fascism actually, especially under Mussolini, had a definitive ideological principle. I mean, well, it might have had it in sort of in this strict book sense philosophy, like we see with libertarians and capitalists, things of that nature. But Mussolini definitely evolves into something different, which makes him fascinating, right? That's where I think he differs. There's some of the more stringent parts of fascism that I think would have been very problematic, and that being simply a third secular liberal ideology. He really breaks from that. I got to be honest, and he considers all facets. Corporatism itself, he realizes pretty early on that this thing is going to be hard to implement. It may take 2 generations. He doesn't push it overly hard. He pushes it where he can at times, but not overly hard. I think he runs basically kind of like a Keynesian system of sorts. You tax, you have certain social structures or government projects, right? And again, and it comes down also to the battle and the language war that we play. Because Mussolini comes out, calls himself a socialist, right? What does he do as a socialist? Okay, you got the political wing of the syndicalist system, right? You can argue that's socialism to a certain degree, though I would argue what's, like I said, in the West isn't any different. It's actually worse, as government has taken complete power and control over there, right? This is why we have this big bureaucratic monster in America today. And so you got that. Mussolini, I think, instills a pension plan. He instills worker health compensation or disability compensation. He has massive infrastructure in the country, building bridges and roads and things of that nature. Remember, he's working with big business at times, right? He does work with them, specifically with Fiat, the car manufacturer, the owner there. Got his name now. I forgot his name. But he's building infrastructure, he's taxing, he's spending, he's building the country, he's trying to pull the nation out of the Great Depression era. Not that Italy was nearly as adversely affected as America was, because Italy was an agricultural nation, it was a heavy fishing nation, it has some industry, but not a lot of industry, right? And so, but because he comes out of that Marxist school, and Eastern Europe, and really all of Western Europe at that time too, especially in France and Britain, everything is shifting to the left, right? This isn't America that's isolated, protected by 2 massive bodies of water where, you know, pre-industrial revolution, everybody can find a little spot in America, hide out, and we call that limited government. The moment the industrial revolution hits, big government comes screaming into America pretty fast and pretty hard. Look where we're at today. But in a part of the world, in a continent like Europe, that was geographically much more condensed, right? They had to deal with each other. This idea of the laissez-faire, you know, economic system, it wasn't going to happen in Europe. liberal republics have risen, and liberal republic governments have taken control of nations and states, and you were going to have to deal with it. Mussolini calls himself a socialist because he's dealing with the problems that present themselves, the circumstances by which Italy finds itself in. America is in a different circumstance until the Industrial Revolution, and then it tilts toward the left as socialism hardcore, right? And while Mussolini is doing infrastructure, passing a pension plan in Italy, workers' health benefits or workmen's compensation, FDR is doing the same thing, and then even then some. FDR is passing Social Security reform, workers' rights, a bunch of infrastructure to try and pull America out of the Great Depression at the time. I mean, just the fact that America is a bigger nation, bigger economy. It's printing money. It has to do more, at least attempt to do more, to pull the nation out of the Great Depression because of the market crash of the 1920s. Why don't we call FDR a socialist? Why don't we? We don't do that. The reason why we don't want to do that is because as Americans, we don't want to admit that we have fallen for the same things that happened in Europe. And it's funny because even Mussolini called FDR a fellow fascist because he saw what he was doing. That was the way of the world, and America was not exempt from that. See, the problem here is that everybody is in Realville with the exception of the classical liberals and the conservatives, right? The laissez-faire guys, right? That deal in utopianism, right? Every time we have a problem in America, we blame the government. We got to get back to the founding principles. We got to get back to limited government. But is limited government even possible in a secular republic? When have we ever seen it? Government grows and grows and grows, and nobody has an answer to this, right? So you may want to look at the fact that the syndicalist system is a form of Marxism, and yet America has gone even further to the left, I would argue, without any means of control of government intervention, as the government has grown and grown and grown pretty much since the founding. I mean, you can even argue, even at the Constitutional Convention, when they gathered there simply to tweak the Articles of Confederation, and they scrapped it and gave us a whole new constitution, you could argue that was trouncing on a certain element of individual rights. There goes your limited government at the convention, for crying out loud. And we've seen America grow in steroids. So by the time we get to FDR, you got Mussolini calling FDR a fellow fascist, and hence here comes the response to that was libertarianism that rose in the 60s and the 70s, right? But we've already lost control. Government is already massive in America at this point. How do you get it under control? Or getting back to the founding principles, limited government, personal responsibility. How do you do that in a nation that doesn't have a moral arbiter of truth, that can't correct right and wrong, where individual rights run supreme? And the individual says, listen, I don't want to do this, or I can't do this, or I'm broken, or my husband died, or I'm disabled. I need help here. I need help here. This is why the idea, well, you got to pull yourself up by your bootstrap. Listen, it's a noble idea. We all should work hard, right? This is what we were taught in the old world. This is what Jesus taught us, right? A man who doesn't fish, he doesn't eat, that kind of a thing. It's a great standard. But in the old world, in the Catholic world, under that guild system, we had certain social structures in place. First of all, we had the family in place because we had the faith in place. In America, we wiped out the faith for religious liberty. We destroyed the faith, in the process destroying the culture and the family. And then how do we expect people to pick themselves up when they fall in this fallen world? You've destroyed the family through religious indifferentism. Who helps the individual that falls? It has to be government. This is why government always has to grow in the West. So you can appeal to this pie in the sky utopian vision of we got to get back to the founding and limited government. It's never really existed. The moment we get to the Industrial Revolution in the mid 1800s, America is becoming just as socialist as Europe is. That's the bottom line. And that's the reality that conservatives and classical liberals never want to deal with. In Italy, the fascists were simply saying, listen, this is the world we inherited. We're reacting. We're breaking away from socialism and communism because that is too extreme to the left. And they're trying to bring it back to the middle while acknowledging there's problems with the Marxists. They're overly suppressive over there, while over here in the West, they're overly based on individual rights. How do we balance? How do we fix this? We got constant strikes in our country. We got violence in our country. We have all kinds of moral and social disorder. How do we fix it? That's what they were trying to do. In America, we go perpetually to the left while appealing to these founding principles that nobody ever seems to know how to get us back to. It's a utopian vision, and the country becomes bigger and stronger. The government becomes a bigger bureaucratic mess, that the tentacles, the arms of the nation reach and stretch over the arms of every individual. So tell me here, who is really closer on this pendulum to Marxism? Is it the fascists that at least are dealing openly and honestly and upfront with it? Or is it the capitalists that have been snickered or bamboozled into these massive bureaucratic governments now throughout all of the West? It's not just America. It's every liberal republic of the West. Tell me which one at this point is not a quasi-Marxist nation at this point. At least the fascists were trying to fight back against Marxism. That's what it was founded upon, the idea of fighting back. But classical liberal nations, they've capitulated, all in the name of these ideological principles without any social structures, without any moral order in place. They got rid of the church, they destroyed the culture, they destroyed the family, and now we tell everybody, hey, dog-eat-dog world, right? Survival of the fittest, pull yourself up by your bootstrap or you starve, right? Oh, but since some conservatives come back and say, wait, we're not libertarians. Okay. But now you're doing what Mussolini did, right? You're putting the individual within the framework of a greater social structure, right? Now it's a debate how far that social structure interacts with the economy, capital versus labor. This is what they were trying to figure out when nobody wanted to listen to. And again, it comes down to the basic notion that liberalism robbed the greater elements of faith, natural law, the church, the family, the familial structure. It put it in the hands of individuals that could do whatever they want under the guise of liberalism, and the individual nature of man has driven the West off the cliff at this point. And what is the answer by a classical liberal friend? We got to get back to the founding principles and the Constitution. Listen, guys, if we could actually do that, I would agree with you. But it's not possible. The system has been broken. The system you gave us has been corrupted, because there was nobody to challenge government. In the old world, at least you had the church. You had the moral principles. The church was always a check on government. But who checks the government here? Who's going to take it on? What, Bill and Sally trying to raise 5 kids on the West Coast while DC's cutting backdoor deals? Who helps the average family? You guys want to talk about, well, we need an engaged citizenship to keep a government accountable. How the hell does the average family do that? Especially now that that same government introduced the printing of money and has exacerbated the cost of living everywhere. People are trying to feed their families. People are trying to survive in this usury system, a usury system that the Catholic world condemned, by the way, that the Catholics told you was going to be a problem if you didn't have a certain social and moral order, but you didn't listen. Now the family has been totally crushed. They've lost complete power of their lives. They're at the mercy of a big bureaucratic government. And you guys want to say, what? We got to get back to the founding principles? The same founding principles that got us here? At least the fascist regime was being honest to a certain degree. I don't know if it would have worked. It might have ended up the same, but at least they were being honest about what they were trying to do and be upfront and deal with a lot of these problems that both the Marxists and the capitalists have never wanted to deal with. So that's my crack shot at the philosophy of fascism, and whether it's an extension of Marxism without internationalism. I hope I explained it right. I could be wrong. You guys correct me in the chat room. I appreciate you joining me. Guys, I'm doing the best I can as I read, continue to learn, study. That's what I'm doing right now. And this is part 8 of Mussolini, an Italian-American perspective. I want to thank you for joining me tonight. This is Frank signing off for Frankly Speaking. Good night, everybody!